Okay, Bill. Welcome to the podcast, Conversation for 2025. In these dark political days, we're going to bring a bit of light, I hope, with talking about writing in photo books.
I'm ready.
Well, good. I'm going to start with something. Now, I never do any research, you know that, um, but
I
I've
do.
but I've done some, and I'm going to read something from what I think is the best piece of text ever put at the front of a photo book.
We have not planned this, we have not talked. I'm just going to I'm just going to throw something out there to see is it Jack Kerouac in The Americans?
Yeah, that's why we never get on.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. Robert Frank, Swiss, unobtrusive, nice, with that little camera that he raises and snaps with one hand. He sucked a sad poem right out of America onto film, taking rank among the tragic poets of the world. To Robert Frank, I now give this message, you got eyes. And I say, that little old lonely elevator girl, looking up, sighing in an elevator full of blurred demons, what's her name and address?
That's such a wonderful line. And I also pulled a line from that introduction, which I was going to read. And I was debating between my line and your line. I might like your line better, but may I?
Yeah, of course.
To quote Jack Kerouac, what a poem this is. What poems can be written about this book of pictures someday by some young new writer, high by candlelight, bending over them, describing every gray, mysterious detail, the gray film that caught the actual pink juice of humankind.
It's just genius, isn't it?
It is.
So that was completely unplanned. Um, Literally, we're on the same page.
Yes.
Um, and let's just talk about that, shall we? Why is that so great, do you think? And why have both of us? I mean, I came up with this idea. You went off, I went off. We've come up with the same thing. Why did you go for that? What's so great to you about Kerouac's introduction to Robert Frank's The American?
Um, for many reasons. One is I don't think anybody expected it. Or nobody knew about the book then, but when you go and reach for the book, you don't expect to have somebody like that. Um, for me, one of the beautiful things, aside from the prose, is that Kerouac doesn't tell us how to feel. And I'll talk about this more when we get deeper into the purpose and the pitfalls of text in a photo book. But one thing that I don't like is when the writer of the foreword tells us what we're going to feel. And Kerouac sees the pictures, understands the pictures, shares his enthusiasm for them, but doesn't dictate what they mean to us. And I like that quite a lot. I also like the fact that he is not a person in the photo world. He's not talking about the history of photography and where these fit in and where they don't. And he's just coming at them really as one poet to another.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you say that because for me, when Kerouac writes, even when he's writing outside of this book, they are word pictures, they are word photographs. They are so abstract, but also it's emotional. So there isn't that kind of academic, dry, kind of pulling apart analysis. He's just giving us a visceral, emotional response.
And his writing is visual. The pink juice of humankind, the gray film, it's right there for us. And so these two mediums speak to each other, but they don't step on each other's toes.
No. And also, for me, he's a great writer. And if we're going to talk about people writing in books, where better place to start than with somebody who can write?
Yeah, and I do have plenty to say about that too. But maybe we should step back, if you're okay with this, and talk about why you wanted to talk about text in photo books.
Okay, for a number of different reasons. I think one of those reasons is because so often it's forgotten about as being important to provide context. I think quite often it's written by the photographer and it can be detrimental to the work. It's always the place I want to start. For me, it's the place that should set the tone for the work. And too often, I don't think it understands that. So I thought maybe it was worth having the conversation because so many of the people who listen to this podcast and engage with us are talking about photo books, but only from the photographic perspective. And we've spoken about the design perspective a lot. We've spoken about print, we've spoken about production, we've spoken about the pacing, the narrative. We've never spoken about the words.
Well, I'm so glad you brought it up. These days, one of the main things I do, and I spend a lot of time, is helping photographers make their photo books. And in some ways, it's often the same conversation when it comes to the words. And usually they say, I'd like a foreword, and then I'd like sort of some explanatory text, and then at the end, an afterword and maybe an essay. And my thoughts on photo books have been and text in photo books have been evolving quite a bit. And although I'm somebody who writes a lot of text for these photo books and enjoy it, I'm starting to like photo books that just um, cold open, that you're in the work. You don't need a big preamble to tell you what to look for in this work or what to expect or who this person is, and just get me right in. And hopefully we'll talk about the physical place for words, as opposed to also, I think what you were talking about was the emotional, intellectual, contextual place for words.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's two ways of looking at it, isn't there? There's kind of introduction and there's kind of forward and afterward. And quite often the afterward can be much more valuable in providing a sort of secondary contextual understanding of the work, whereas the work itself perhaps tells us a story. We look at it, we think we understand it, and then we read something, we think, oh, I've got to go back to that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's that. I'm I'm now team afterward. I'm also team middle. One thing I've been doing with some of these books is taking a break from the pictures. You dive right into the pictures. Maybe you look at 50 pages, and then there's a break, and then you have more pictures, and maybe you have a little bit more context for the pictures or for the photographic process, and then you're able to look at the second half of the book, um, and then there's the afterword. Now, I suspect that when people come to a book like that, they might skip the text in the middle, the Q&A, the interview, whatever it is, and look at the pictures, because I happen to think that people come to photo books not for the writing. I think they come to them for the pictures.
I think they come for the experience. And I think
Mhm. Okay.
the bringing of the two things together could actually be really important. But also, I fear, and again, this is something we've spoken about, there are templates out there as to how people think should a photo book should look.
Yeah.
It's just adopted as a template without due consideration of the actual material, the narrative, or whatever is being, attempted.
Yes. And I think that that is really something that more photographers should be considering. Just because other books have these various pieces and touchstones, it does not mean your book has to. Every book, I believe, should be approached sort of on its own merits. One of my favorite photo books from last year was Brian Schutmatt's Sons of the Living. Big, oversized book, gorgeously produced from Trespasser Books, starts right with a picture. There's no text until I think it's the last page of the book essentially, and then there's only a little bit, and it's a great choice.
So, who have you been talking to? Because I'm sure you've been talking to some people.
I have. I mean, I guess before we even start into that, just to take off on something you said, a lot of photographers write their own texts. Um, Nobody expects a writer to be a good photographer. And I don't think we should expect good photographers to also be good writers. There's no reason that they should be. And so I don't want people to feel pressure to or feel guilty about, not writing their own text. I don't think um, it's an imperative.
I wonder if, and this may be controversial, but hey, that wouldn't be the first time I've said something controversial. But what is it amongst photographers that they feel that they're great designers, that they're great photographers, that they're great writers, and that they're going to do everything? And what is that? I don't quite get it.
I don't know either. I've wondered about that. I mean, I think some photographers are very self-sufficient. They might go off into the field. They may or may not develop their own work. Um, and then I think that there's an ownership of it and a sense of, I can do all these things. I think it's often misplaced. And I think the fact that Robert Frank did not write his own introduction, but found somebody quite interesting to add another layer to it. I kind of feel like if you're the photographer, you've said what you've said with your pictures. Now let's have somebody else perhaps shine a different light or unpeel a different layer that perhaps you weren't thinking about. And I think that's great.
Well, it's that thing of collaboration, isn't it? I always think of Robert Frank and the Kerouac with Paul My Daisy, the film that, of course, he made.
Right.
And, that same sense in a way, I always feel that Paul My Daisy is kind of like the filmic version of the Americans.
Hmm. I, totally. And I guess I wish we had other. We've talked about the Americans and Robert Frank and Jack Kerouac a few times. I'm hoping in our conversation we can hit on some other people who've done interesting things. Um, so I don't know if any come to mind or will be coming to mind, but I think that would be helpful as well.
Well, I had a bit of research into I've actually done some work
Hmm,
with
excellent.
and I couldn't find much that I thought was really, really interesting. Um,
Hmm.
I thought it was interesting with Walker Evans and Agee. I thought it was really interesting with Baldwin and Avedon. So I was really drawn to these kind of collaborations between writers and photographers, with photographers stepping out
Hmm.
their comfort zone. And when I was looking at some of the sort of the classic, I was really going for the classics, I suppose, really, as well as recent stuff. And I found lots of stuff that was okay, but I didn't find a lot of stuff that was great.
Hmm. Um, have you spent time with Matt Black's American Geography?
Yeah, I have. And funnily enough, of course, I interviewed Matt on the
That's right.
podcast. Matt and I had a really great conversation actually about that. Um, but I think that what was interesting about that was that he approached the entire project like a diary. And in a sense, the book is a diary.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say was, um, he has written text about what he was doing, but for me, it's the chapter openings and even some of the which as you say play like diary or journal and some of the captions too. And I did feel that was the kind of rare case that is effective with a photographer including his or her own simple, stripped down, and not prescriptive text. I mean, for me, and I'll probably say this 47 times during our conversation, I hate when people tell me what I should think or feel. Um, and so when an academic or a photographer writes about what they sort of expect me to feel as I look at these pictures, I want to throw the book across the room.
But I think that's again, when I was talking to Matt, it was very much at the beginning of the process that he understood how he was going to incorporate text. And too often, I think that photographers think about the text at the end and it's a bit of an afterthought. And I think that for me, it either should come from an emotional perspective or alternatively, it should come from somebody who is an expert on the subject matter rather than the photographs.
We're going to get into that very soon, and I could not agree more. I would rather not have somebody talk to me about the pictures, the composition, the lighting, the where they fit in the canon, and really talk to me about what it's like to be in that community or at that time or some other aspect of it.
Well, I think of two photo books that I've been asked to write text for in particular. Two photographers who I've known for a very long time. One I met when I was 12 years of age, and we were at school together and so forth. And when I was asked to write the text, I wrote for both books about the person, and I
Right.
wrote about my kind of response to the person, their personality, their character. And both times, the photographers have come back to me and said, well, yeah, okay, that's not really what I was expecting. And I don't really see myself that way, but I will put it in the book. They both said, and they're in the books. Uh, for me, that was a success because maybe I've added something to the understanding. I don't know if I have or not. I can only do what I can do.
Right.
But I would never sit down and when I never talk about photographs really, and I never really want to give my opinion on the photograph. I don't really think my opinion matters. I think people's opinion, I want to know about the photographer. That's what I want to know about, the person.
Right. I feel the same way. To a large degree, although, you know, go, because we started with Kerouac, I like when a writer tells us how it makes him or her feel, not telling us what the reader should feel or what the photographs elicit. How they, I don't know, his photographs kindle our emotions and put us deep in the chaos of his struggle with identity. I don't want to know that. Um, but I do want to know perhaps what the writer is feeling when struck with these pictures, which I think Kerouac does quite well.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And actually, all of that interpretation of the photography, I think Kerouac did in when he just said, "You got eyes." I don't think we need to go any further
That's right.
than that. So listen, you keep teasing me. Who
I
I
know.
never know who you've spoken
I
to.
know. I
Uh,
know. I like to surprise you. Um, I spoke with Blake Andrews, and I have my notes over here, which is why you get my profile. Blake is a photographer based in Oregon. He also studies a lot of photo books, and you can read his thoughts and his reviews on his excellent Instagram feed, which is how I came upon him. You can search for his name or type Blake Andrews backwards to find him. Um, but his writing is knowledgeable and entertaining, and I look forward to it. So I asked Blake, um, what makes a great text moment or experience in a photo book, and this is what he told me. First off, a general disclaimer. These are just my opinions. There are a zillion ways to make a photo book, and no method is right or wrong by itself. The role of the text depends on the specific interaction of book, pictures, photographer, audience, materials, and more. Um, that's tough to state categorically, he says definitively, because it can change from book to book. For example, I love Kerouac's Introduction to the Americans, but I think that's more the exceptional case than the model to follow. For me, poetic prose and photos don't usually mix well, but hey, it's friggin' Kerouac. Hard to go wrong with someone like that. Where the Americans might be a better role model, he says, is in the commissioning of outside voices to write for photo books. Photography can sometimes be an insular field with bookmakers and readers pulled from the same community. So I think it's healthy sometimes to throw non-photographers into the mix. Could be a poet like Kerouac, or maybe a musician or a chef or a bike messenger or whatever. Anyone who writes well and can help the book branch out of the photo click. Um, we need more of those perspectives in photo books.
Well, we agree with Blake, don't we?
Yes, we do. Um, we have a phrase in America, or whatever's left of America, that refers to inside baseball, which is experts and obsessives writing or thinking or talking to other obsessives and experts, and it leaves out so many people. And as photography is the most democratic of the art mediums, I think it should be more expansive. So. For a book I worked on and that was published in December called Camera Girl, which was a collection of Polaroids that this woman Sharon Smith took in New York dance clubs in the go-go 80s. So we had a current DJ named Honey Dijon, who's very hot. Um, I spoke with her about what the pictures mean to her and how they capture the scene that influenced her so much. And it was a perspective I couldn't have possibly brought to bear. And it was great to hear this person and how they were influenced by the scene, and then how these photographs play into that. Um,
But I think, if I was to play devil's advocate with myself and with you here, I had a conversation recently on the podcast with David Campney, um, which was a great conversation. And I thought David was great,
yep,
really open, really a passionate guy about photography. Now, he writes the foreword for so many books. I mean, he just unbelievable amounts of books. And I can understand why a photographer feels the need to have somebody like Campany write that forward to give the book a certain kind of weight and kudos. Um, because you can say introduction by David Campany on the cover, for
yep.
example. So perhaps it's quite a brave thing to go kind of away from that world.
It is, I wasn't thinking about David when I was kind of putting some thoughts together here, but thinking more about academics. And if there's one thing I really don't like, it's a foreword by an academic who writes like an academic. And I feel so often, and a lot of photographers who I work with in making their books approach me and they say, is there an academic or a curator or somebody in a museum who can? And I feel like it shows insecurity. Um, I feel like yes, someone like David adds a lot of weight and gravitas to it. At the same time, I sort of want the photographs to talk to us. And like there was this one example of this photographer who I happen to love, and he shot many years ago, and he shot this one body of work. He shot a black series of black communities. He was a white photographer. The people who made the book were clearly so nervous about the idea of a white photographer shooting black people that they brought in a couple of academics to basically say what a colonialist he was, kind of how out of place he was to make these pictures. It was sort of a self-flagellation out of an insecurity that the pictures wouldn't just be taken on their own, but would be put in some kind of a politically correct narrative. And I'm sure I'm going to offend a lot of people by saying that, but it damaged the book. For me, it ruined the experience of looking at these pictures.
Because it lost
Which is not to say those ideas aren't important, because they are, but I'm not sure that, bookending this work with um, academic treatise is the right way to get at some of these important issues.
because it lost its purity by doing that.
Um, I don't know what that means exactly.
In the photographer had an intention, but that the publisher felt that they needed to add something to it.
Yeah, and they needed to undercut it and contextualize it. And sure, we think a lot about colonialism, rightly so, now, and otherism. But when these pictures were made, that was not a thing, which is not to say it shouldn't have been a thing. But it wasn't like the photographer violated something when he was making the pictures. And if he hadn't taken these pictures, we wouldn't be able to see these communities because nobody was taking those kind of pictures at that time. And I don't know, it just it weighted these pictures. Maybe this is what you're saying. It put so much weight and negativity on these pictures that it was even hard to kind of look at them as the photos themselves. And maybe that was the point of the text. I don't know.
Well, I think that that raises an issue, doesn't it, that we've already mentioned we're gonna deal with in a future conversation. That idea of can a photographer make work if they're not specifically from the environment or the community in which
Yeah.
they're making that work. But you use the word there of context, and I do think that that writing should bring a context to the work, to the photographer, to the subject matter. Who else did you speak to, Bill?
Well, I have more from Blake.
Oh, let's hear that.
Yes, and he touches on something that you and I spoke with about a minute ago about photographers writing their own text. He says, as for photographers doing their own writing, Jim Goldberg always integrates text seamlessly with his images, as in his recent book, Coming and Going. He's a master and makes the blending process look much easier than it actually is. I suspect he's doing this not at the end, as you suggest, but from the beginning, part of the conceptuals. My favorite text of any photo book is probably Mike Brody's essay In a Period of Juvenile Prosperity. It is so raw and direct and honest. He's just writing from the heart with no pretense, and the prose is gutting. If I can make any generalities about photo book texts, Brody might be a good model. Open, honest writing, straight to the point, without fancy words and accolades. Um, and I guess, to reiterate what we said before, I would say to photographers, sort of don't try this at home. Um, if there's someone who's writing you really like and that speaks to you and they like how he or she wraps up ideas, ask them if they would be interested in writing about this topic matter or the photos or how it meets or you as a person.
Yeah, but again, I think what Blake's saying there about that particular writing is it's emotional. Again, it ties with that kind of emotional kind of connection that we
Yes,
want to have with images as well as with words.
yes. I asked Blake, what are some of the common mistakes you see photographers make when it comes to text? And he says, I generally don't like ornate or overly academic language. Writing about yourself in the third person is a turnoff. Quoting what others have said about your work is a turnoff. Listing shows that you've done is a turnoff. Yawn. Long words that I have to look up in a dictionary, run-on sentences, over-theorized explanations. All those things are turnoffs. Skip the self-aggrandizing. Instead, I like photographers who write naturally the way that they would talk in a conversation. Just my preference. In terms of design, it's sort of parenthetical, computer fonts attempting to replicate handwriting are a deal killer. They're lazy, soulless, and ugly. Any book that uses those fonts goes straight into the recycling bin.
Though, I think he raises an interesting point there, and because I am engaged with education and teaching, um, I'm aware of that writing in the third person as being something that's taught. I teach it myself when it comes to writing about stuff on websites, about yourself and so forth, putting it in the third person. Um, I think that what a lot of that connects to is that idea of people making photo books that we've spoken about before, who are coming straight out of education of some form and sort of replicating the idea of what's handed in for a grade within academia and not understanding that there should be an evolution of that work if it's going to exist without outside of academia.
Right. For sure. And I mean, I agree with that 1,000%. And I sort of feel, as I said earlier, the less academia in photo books for me personally, the better. I really like hearing, the writer's voice. And I think readers would too, but not necessarily their writing, which is why in some of the photo books I've worked on recently, I've done interviews with the writer so that we hear his or her voice, but they're not forced to write stiff prose.
Yeah, I really like that approach. I have to say, I've said it many times, I'll say it again. As far as I'm concerned, academia is the only nut you can't make a cake with.
Um, another thing I spoke with Blake, and this is only because every photographer I work with, we hit this place in our conversation about on-page captions. Um, and so I put the question to Blake, and he said, my answer is the same as for adult incontinence. Depends. Um, with captions, which are purely descriptive, location and date, my preference is to separate photos from their captions. An index in the back of the book works better for this purpose. Sometimes captions can interact with and support the image in real time. Take Avedon's In the American West, for example, where the blunt descriptions really color how the portraits are received, or the sly captions in Deanne Arbus's monograph, which are just as effective. In those books, it's fitting to include them near the photos. Then there's Andrew Savulich's The City, with its deadpan descriptions like surreal newspaper captions. They're fantastic. They belong with the images, but every book is different. There are no rules.
Yeah, well, that's what always upsets people when we say to them there are no rules. And people are like, but tell me the rules, tell me the rules. I'm like, there are no rules.
Well, when I when I worked in magazines for years and years and years, there was a rule which I largely subscribed to, which was every photo gets a caption, and I think that's right in magazines, but books aren't magazines, and it's a whole different experience and a different prospect.
Yeah, I'm again, I'm repeating myself, but I always used to say that there were about 7 or 8 rules in magazines, which I used to teach art directors. And I remember an art director coming up to me years later and saying, Grant, I still follow the rules. And I said, well, you've missed the point. I told you the rules so that you could break them, not that so you could keep following them. Because if you don't
Right.
know the rules, then actually what you're doing is you're just making mistakes.
And I would have to say, to your point earlier, I think there are a lot of photographers who, when they go to make their books, um, tend to want to follow the rules, which is forward, dedication, forward, intro, blah, blah, picture, afterward, acknowledgments. And I think that you can shake that stuff up somewhat.
Yeah, we always say that, don't we? You've got to shake it up. I'm just fed up with seeing cloth-bound books with type-only covers with one word, which are wonderfully kind of refined and so forth, but just boring.
100%. Okay, let's see. I just threw Blake a catch-all question, and I said, anything else you'd like to add? And he said, I think Mark Twain said it best, write what you know. If you do that, you should be okay. It's when photographers steer away from that advice that they run into trouble. Of course, that's just my take, and what do I know?
Yeah.
Um, he's a great writer, and he really knows his photo books, and I suggest people take a look at his Instagram.
It sounds great. I'm going to have a look at that. That sounds good. And of course, all we're doing is expressing opinions. What the hell do we know either?
Exactly. I also spoke with Dominic Pollan, who runs the publishing arm of Idea, which is a London-based bookseller, publisher, clothing brand. I worked closely with Dom in making Camera Girl, the book I just talked about, and was just incredibly impressed by his approach, how he thinks about photo books and readers, and how he really has, because Idea does a very specific kind of book and their audience. He really thinks about their audience. He knows who the audience is, and he wants to make a book for his audience. And really, really loved working with him. And I believe, I could be wrong here, but I believe he also went to a school called St. Martin's at some point. So,
A great place, so I hear.
so I've heard. Um, I asked Dom what makes for a great text moment in a photo book. Um, and he said, it needs to be exciting. The text is ideally in the photographer's own words or someone very close to them or someone who is in the book and can truly add something personal to the experience. Diary entries, short anecdotes, interviews, poems are usually the most successful for us at Idea. That's what we want. Generally, we don't edit much unless it's boring or grammatically incorrect. The shorter, the better, always in the writer's voice. In the colophon section, artists can go wild. We've had equipment lists and Buddhist mantras in addition to all the legal credits.
Okay, well there you go then. If it's funny, if you go back in time to a lot of photo books from the 1960s, 70s, 50s, but way back actually, you would always start the book with the name of the camera the pictures were taken on.
Hmm.
You'd always get the exposures. So there was very much even a Bill Brandt type book or, that kind of thing. Um, so there have always been templates out there that people followed. But I think now, because so many people see photo books as kind of contemporary art practice, art books, that they've slipped into that world, and actually that's quite a narrow world.
I think it is, and I'm hoping, and I'm always hoping for photo books that, can edge along that because it is a form that we know and that we appreciate, and there are some expectations, but break out of it at the same time. And I think that, Blake in a different answer mentioned the Mimi Plum book, which is terrific. I'm trying to find his note right here. The White Sky, he says, the prelude is interspersed with the title in huge, bold lettering, almost a cinematic experience. And it's a resting point after a few photos. And I think that's the kind of thing that we're talking about.
Exactly. And you can hear Mimi Plum on a previous episode of the podcast talking about what
Fantastic.
photography means to her. So,
I want to pick up on one small thing that Dom um, mentioned but kind of glossed over. I mean, and he said, unless there's a sort of glaring grammatical error or it's way too long, we don't usually touch the prose, the text. And that's what I found in all the work I've done with a lot of publishers, and in a lot of books I've seen. You can tell that this text has not been edited. I think that is something photographers should really know and think about. Unlike the web, where if you make a typo or a mistake, you can go back and fix it. Photo books are forever-ish, or at least for decades, and you will feel terrible if you have a typo in your photo book. So in the projects that I take on, I insist on having a copy editor slash proofreader, um, because I frankly don't want my name on anything that it isn't sparkling and perfect. And I work with a few copy editors and proofreaders who do know photo books, and so if anybody is looking for them, they can contact me and I can put them in touch.
yeah, I can do the same. Actually, it makes me think of a friend of the podcast, Mark Wilson, photographer, who is quite prolific in producing
Yes.
books, which are quite copy heavy. And I put him in touch with a proof editor, and they've now worked together on a number of books. And he really sees the benefit of that. And of course we do.
Yeah. From my perspective as a longtime editor, the editor is really standing in the reader's shoes and is making sure that what's being communicated is what the reader wants. Um, and a copy editor and proofreader just really puts that extra top layer to make sure that everything is communicated perfectly and without mistakes.
Exactly. Good grammar, good syntax, just so important.
I asked Dom, what are some of the common mistakes you see photographers make when it comes to text? He said, some overthink it or try to over intellectualize it. I personally wouldn't read or trust a pseudo-academic, overly historical, overly technical text in a photography book, at least not the ones we publish. And those who said a photo book needs and who said a photo book needs any text at all? Some of our most successful books, like Norbert Schorner's Prada campaigns or Purien's books, have no full sentences at all, only credits and titles. If the artist has to think too hard about what books to include, then just let the images speak for themselves. Only include what's truly perfect and provides more insight into the work.
Well, there you go. I mean, that's where we are, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the key to it is being appropriate to the project. And I think when we've spoken about design and everything else we've spoken about, we always come down to the same conclusion, which is that it's got to be appropriate for the project. Don't put something in because you think you should. Don't try and be clever about it. Just kind of be honest.
And I think when it comes to text, I would say think about text as something additive, not trying to boost up the photos or you know, overly contextualize them. I think that comes off as I think that comes off the wrong way. And so um, I hope that people will start to think about the place of text, which I think is important in these books, but perhaps in a new or different or slightly more expansive way.
I wonder if you think the same as I do. When we used to work on magazines, I always used to say to people that the successful magazine is the one that brings text and image together to make both stronger. Do you feel the same with a photo book?
I 100% feel the same with a photo book. And then the one other thing I would probably, well, I mean, it's related to the magazine experience, but how the pictures or the stories sit next to each other. The sequencing and how they surprise. And I think sometimes, in the magazine world, we used to have text, 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 and then a giant pull quote or a surprising photo. And I think that kind of packaging, surprise, delight, keeping the reader off guard in a good way, is another aspect of it. And I guess to what we were saying before, the formula of where the text supposedly goes by the rules plays against that. Because if you're expecting two essays in the beginning, two essays at the end, boring. Mix it up a little bit. Try something new.
Well, that's the problem is if you design something so quietly, it may not be heard.
Yeah. I think that's 100% right. And I think it might be worth us going back to what gets a photo book heard in addition to the photos. And, you were sort of implying or saying that David Campany's name gets it heard. I think in this camera girl photo book, having this DJ with a fairly large following gets it heard. Sometimes I think the writer that you bring in um, can bring his or her own audience. In addition to the perspective, can bring an audience to your photo book and get more people to see it.
Which sounds perhaps to
Crass.
yeah, well, not necessarily crass, but perhaps to some people listening to this, cynical.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, I think it is cynical. Um,
But is
I,
that a bad thing? I don't think so.
I mean, Jack Kerouac was a big deal when Robert Frank got him to write that text. I'm guessing Frank, from what I know about him, wasn't trying to sell books by getting that name on it. He wanted a writer and a poet who understood what was going on. Um,
And I guess they were friends as well.
yes, yes, they were kind of in that boho New York circle. But even if it's crass, if the person is adding something personal or insightful, um, I think it can work. And it's hard to sell photo books these days. That there are not that many photo book stores. They don't get covered, widely in mainstream publications unless they're a certain kind of book. And so sometimes a little something like that can help.
Yeah, I mean, I've written about that so many times that photographers have kind of got to get over this issue that some have, that it's okay to be commercial and it's
Right.
okay. I mean, I was in a meeting recently with some academics, you'll be pleased to know, and they were complaining about the fact that once they'd written their books, that the publishers expected them to promote the books through their social media. And that was such hard work. Having finished the book, they really didn't have enough energy to actually do that. And obviously, I was absolutely horrified. I was like, well, if you're not going to talk about it, no one's going to talk about it, for goodness sake. And it isn't that much hard work, and it isn't a sellout. It's just the world we live in.
Did they think it was hard work or did they think it made them dirty?
Probably a little bit of both. Perhaps it was put forward as hard work, but actually kind of demeaned the work by making it
Right.
commercial. I just read a very interesting novel, actually, called Caledonian Road by a writer called Andrew O'Hagan. And it features an academic in it. And at one point, all the other academics don't like him as an academic. And another academic says, you don't get it. Because he says, well, they don't like it because people read my books. And the other academic says, no, 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 you don't get it. They don't like you because you've got an audience.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it kind of hit home with me. And I just thought, yeah, that's actually what we're talking about here. If you've got an audience, that isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing.
And I think when people make their photo books, and this is kind of tagging on to what you were saying before, that a lot of times photographers make their photo books and then think of the text as an afterthought. My experience is they also think of the publicity and promotion and marketing of the book as an afterthought. Um, I approach that from the very beginning. When I'm looking at photographs or stories, I'm thinking about who wants to know about this? I mean, yes, people who buy photo books will be interested in this, but that's relatively speaking, a fairly small audience that talks to themselves. But how do we get this book to break out of the photo book, excuse me, ghetto, and reach a wider audience? And that is a strategic thing that I sort of try to build into the books that I help photographers build. And sometimes what helps, one extra hook, is somebody who would write a forward or an afterword or a blurb or um, some way to package the book that allows more outlets to consider it for publication.
I think we've come up with some advice that might actually be useful, Bill.
Damn.
I know we've let ourselves down yet again. Um, but I think, it just connects with everything else we've said that, you've got to see the text alongside everything else. It's about planning, it's about expectation, it's about a cohesive nature of the photo book. That's really all it boils down to.
And sometimes it's about restraint and bringing in people who might know how to do this better than you do and
Yeah,
not being ashamed about that.
no, in that sense, but perhaps we should get a couple of podcasters in. Uh, to do
God forbid. God forbid.
There's
But I would be curious because I think there are a lot of questions about photo books. If photographers who are listening um, have questions for us about this, and maybe there's a segment where we speak to those questions directly, because I'm sure we haven't covered everything that needs to be covered here, because photo books have taken kind of a different role in the world of photography now. And for some people, they're actually three-dimensional business cards. You know, um, it's harder to get a show. It's certainly harder to get your photographs in magazines because they don't exist and there are fewer pages. So the photo book has taken on this bigger role, and I think people probably have a lot of questions about it that we didn't get to today.
I completely agree. I mean, it's fantastic to hear from you, listeners. And we do hear a lot of stuff from you, giving us suggestions of things to look at, as well as asking us questions and giving your feedback on what we've been talking about. So, as always, you can get hold of Bill directly through his Instagram, which is.
My name at Bill Shapiro, spelled forwards.
And you can always get hold of me through United Nations of Photography.com. I promise you, I reply to every email. I'm on Blue Sky at UN of Photo, as is Bill. I'm pleased to, to
Yes,
be able
yes,
to.
I am.
Listen, Bill, as always, a great conversation. Lovely way to start 2025. I know we've got a lot of conversations planned for the rest of the year, so I'm looking forward to them.
Fantastic, Grant. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.